Right. I think what Trump is doing, mentioning Greenland like he has and Panama Canal, is he's messaging not to the Panamanians or Denmark or you know anybody like that there or the Canadians. He's actually messaging to the Chinese.
Hello and welcome to this week's omnibus edition of Spectator TV. I'm Cindy Yu. Before we get started, do subscribe to the YouTube channel and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, a trade war between the US and Colombia was averted after the Colombian government agreed to allow Donald Trump's deportation flights to land. Freddie Gray spoke to author Todd Bensman to understand more about the standoff.
The first thing to talk about, I think, probably is Colombia, because there was quite a lot of drama yesterday, back and forth between the Colombian government and the White House, which ended, it seems, if the White House is to be believed, but also if most reports are to be believed, with the Colombian government and President Gustavo Petro caving quite suddenly under threat of sanctions from Donald Trump and accepting military planes with migrants being shipped back to Colombia. Is the sort of official story, is that a fair reflection of events?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, as of this moment, it may be over or it may not be over. The last I heard is that he was retaliating, Petro was retaliating with Colombia's own trade tariffs on U.S. goods. But he seemed to be capitulating in the way that he said he just doesn't like military cargo planes. How about using my presidential plane or regular passenger planes? So there may be some wriggle room there for, hey, okay, we won't send them in cargo planes. But I think Trump will hold the line even on the cargo planes. He really needs to make an example here of recalcitrant countries like Colombia that are going to need to take U.S. deportees. It's not just Colombia that is proven to be resistant, but countries all over the world don't want to take back their deportees. Number one, they're criminals, and number two is even the criminals send back remittance money. They like that cash coming back. So they're all kind of addicted to it. Chinese, all the nations of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, etc., are going to have to take their people back, or this is what's going to happen. Trump is sort of he pursues sort of this ideal of the madman theory, like he's crazy. This guy could do anything, kind of a thing. And I think he uses that to his benefit. He just now did it. He just did it with Colombia. So everybody else should be on notice.
Well, you point towards the military planes being a key part of it. And certainly it seems Trump, by sending troops down to seal the border, by flying migrants back, illegal migrants back by military plane, arrested and I believe handcuffed, according to some reports. He is treating them as criminals. And this seems to be where he will butt heads with the international community, many of whom will say they shouldn't be treated like criminals. That's going to be the key point of conflict, isn't it?
Well, what people don't understand about deportation and deportation flights, especially with the class of people that they are targeting, the worst first, is that they are very prone to violence on the plane. We have seen many cases of immigrants in deportation flights tearing up the airplane on the inside, attacking ICE agents, trying to get into the pilot's compartment, refusing to get off the planes onto the tarmacs at home. And so, there's a lot of kind of rebellion that goes on these planes, and sometimes you just have to restrain them. And this particular class of people that they're targeting first are, people that have been arrested for crimes already and convicted of crimes. So they're probably even more prone to attacking cops and ripping up the airplanes. So they have to be restrained. Sorry, that's how it works.
So what you're saying is that the kind of humanitarian bleating that you hear from Latin American countries, from Colombia, is actually really just an excuse because they just don't want these very dangerous and mostly unpleasant people.
Yeah, and exactly. Humanitarian bleating. I'm going to take that. I'm going to borrow that. But yeah, that is kind of what's going on, and I think for them it's more of a slippery slope. It's the worst first, but everybody knows that eventually it's going to be just regular non-criminal, illegally present aliens that are going to be swept up. I mean, this is just the opening seconds of the first round of a very long bout that's going to go on for 4 long years. So eventually, the United States is going to get to non-criminal aliens, and they're going to have to find a good way, a cheap way. Cargo planes are much less expensive than chartered aircraft. It's just easier to do it. And by the way, I've been on these cargo planes. They're not that bad. I don't know. I mean, okay, they're not bringing coffee to you and peanuts, but they're not that terrible. And most immigrants have already gone through weeks and months in really rough conditions on the trail. They're no strangers to a little roughness. This. I'm sorry. You're not going to get much sympathy out of me. I've flown on these cargo planes. They're fine.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Colombia, because probably a lot of our audience aren't really aware of the situation between Colombia and America, particularly vis-a-vis immigration. Was it quite deliberate from the White House to pick this fight with Colombia very early on, to signal that Colombia itself was a major part of the problem?
Right. Well, remember, Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, is a really far left character who comes from, a background of guerrilla fighting. He's a true blue socialist, leftist, communist, and he somehow rose to become the president of Colombia and has been moving his country closer to the axis of Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, away from Western orbit. And so, in that, he's going to automatically find an adversary in Donald Trump. That's a natural. They found an adversary to a certain extent in Joe Biden, even. But now that it's Donald Trump, I mean, all the gloves are off. Trump is not going to um, play nicely in the sandbox with a guy like Petro. Um, Now, I do believe that we want to have good relations. We have trade. They have 17% of their trade is in exports to the United States, and we send gasoline and billions of dollars of goods to Colombia. I think it's in everybody's best interest that there not be a trade war. Plus, it could push this Petro guy further into the arms of China, Iran, Venezuela. But I will say that those government officials in Colombia are very, uh, let's just say, hands off with the Gaitanista Self Defense Force of Colombia, which controls all of the drug trafficking, the cocaine trafficking, and the human smuggling through the Darien Gap. I was just in Colombia, in Gaitanista territory in August of 2024, and what I witnessed there proved to me over the course of a week in their territory that the Colombian government is completely hands off. They are allowing that paramilitary force of 8,000 complete unfettered control of that northwestern section of Colombia, which is, I would argue, completely at odds with U.S. national interests in drug trafficking and in the human trafficking through the Darien Gap. The Colombians should be I think the Trump administration has a lot more to be pissed off about with Colombia than just denying a couple of flights. much more. And I would like to see the Trump administration expand its demands way beyond the Colombia accepting these flights. They need to take on the Gaitanistas and close that Darien Gap, fight them, even if it means with military force.
Well, we discussed the Darien Gap the last time you were on this show, but perhaps remind our viewers what it is, where it starts, where it ends, but also perhaps tell us a bit about, I mean, because the people coming in through the Darien Gap, perhaps from Colombia, are not Colombians necessarily. It's almost the whole of the world is coming in through that gap, is it not?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Yeah, that's right. It's a roadless jungle of about, 80 miles, 60 to 80 miles, depending on where you enter, between Colombia and Panama. And it's a migrant route through which the entire world, people from 180 different countries, have crossed to the U.S. border. They have to go through that jungle route. It's controlled on the Colombian side by the Gaitanista self-defense. They're also called the Clan del Golfo, the Gulf Clan. A lot of people might know that name more. And they've been crossing by the hundreds of thousands under the Biden administration because of the open border at the U.S. have drawn them in. And the Gaitanistas and the Colombian federal government and the local municipalities have all cashed in and enabled this, as well as the United Nations and all these whole group of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to facilitate this. And it's not just a small number; it's close to 2 million people have crossed through that jungle in the last 4 years. Now, right now, the numbers are way, way down. My sources tell me that it's 8% of what it was this time last year, which is fractional. And that's a great news story. And that's largely due to Trump and the fact that he's closed the border, the U.S. border. You're not getting in. And you may not even get through Mexico because we've got the Mexicans doing military operations to shut them down there and block them in Mexico too. So things are getting very difficult. People don't want to go through the Darien Gap because it's expensive and hard and time consuming. So that's a good thing. But the Colombians need to do more on their side to ensure that even that 8%, nobody gets through that area. And it could change at any time. At some point, 3, 4, 5 years from now, maybe it'll open back up again, the Darien Gap. So it needs to be a permanent fix, and it's got to happen by the Colombians on the Colombian side. And the Trump administration needs to make them want to do that.
Well, you say a lot of what's happening is down to the Trump administration coming in, but I think a lot of Democrats would say, and not entirely without reason, that Biden policies were finally clicking into place. Joe Biden finally started making some moves to secure the border. Too late, undoubtedly, as far as the American public is concerned, but that those policies are finally starting to take shape. Is there truth in that argument?
Yes, that is true. Republicans don't like to admit it. It doesn't fit very well with the narrative, but it's just simply true. What the Biden administration did was prepare itself for the 2024 campaign season. It just simply doesn't pay politically to have 10,000 immigrants a day crossing the border while you're campaigning against somebody like Donald Trump, who made suturing up the border his primary campaign pledge. So Biden went down, he had Mayorkas go down and the Secretary of State to Mexico City and cut a deal in December of 2023 for Mexican military operations, 35,000 troops. They put them out and they shut it down very significantly starting in January. The numbers were down by 80% crossing our border. It was probably going to be just up until the election in November at which point Claudia Sheinbaum, the new Mexican president, lots of us expected that she would say, okay, we did our part for your campaign. You lost, but we did our part and we're done suffering. We're going to let them go. There were hundreds of thousands of immigrants trapped in southern Mexico. I was there. I spent a lot of time among them. I saw this entrapment, this enclave down in southern Mexico, interviewed the immigrants. Everybody thought that they were going to be let free finally before Trump could enter office. But then Donald Trump said something at a campaign rally that changed the whole game and made it his, which is he said to Sheinbaum, well, when I get into office, if I see that you've let everybody through, I'm going to put 25% trade tariffs on your country, all your exports, and it'll go to 50% if you still haven't done anything about it, and then 75%, and then 100%. And with that, she kept the military blockade in place. It's still in place now. And we haven't seen the 25% tariff yet in Mexico. So it looks like it worked there as well as Colombia. I guarantee you that the Mexican government is paying very close attention to what Trump just did to Colombia.
You mentioned the worst first policy, which Trump is putting into place. And Tom Homan seems to be the man enforcing this. The borders are. In some ways, though, Todd, is the worst first the easy part? Because these are obviously people who nobody wants in their country, and Americans clearly don't want in their country. They're convicted criminals, sometimes of very heinous crimes, and it's strange to think that they're not already in jail. But next will come, and it seems that the Trump administration is committed to this, next will come the removal by force, perhaps cruelly in some ways, of people who are there illegally but may not be as dangerous. And there are good humanitarian arguments against doing that.
Yeah, what's going on really is a part political, because like you said, who's against removing criminal aliens, murderers and rapists and child molesters who are in the United States illegally? But it's also partly because of infrastructure limitations. And what I mean by that is that, during the last 4 years of the Biden administration, they really systematically closed detention facilities, removed bed space from the table that are needed to detain people, families especially. They closed all the family detention units in the United States. There are none that are open, and they have to be reopened. And also, we don't have really the aircraft. That's why they're bringing cargo planes in. They're going to have to bring more aircraft to bear, detention space, and then lastly, personnel. The Biden administration chained ICE deportation officers to their desks, and the morale was so terrible that a great many of them left. Probably 1,000 deportation agents left the service, and they weren't replaced, because why are you going to replace people that you're not using? So the number is down to about 5,000 nationally. So they're going to have to, it takes time to increase that cadre. But that's why they're using DEA agents and other federal, they're drafting people from other agencies. They're bringing in military troops. All of it is to, start to repair and expand the infrastructure so that they can eventually expand the kind of categories for deportation that they really want, which are the millions that are here illegally, that came in, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. Eventually, I think in the next year or 2 years, when they get the infrastructure back up, you will start to see more systematic deportations of non-criminals of different kinds. You'll see workplace raids. You'll see families rounded up and deported together. No family separation.
How important do you think illegal migrants are to the US economy? Because an argument you hear a lot from liberals, from Democrats, is that illegal migration sort of plugs the gap at the bottom of the economy, the jobs that Americans just don't do or aren't really willing to do. How true is that? And if you are to really clamp down on illegal immigration, how big a problem is that going to be for the functioning of the economy and businesses?
Well, I think that prior to 2021, you could kind of make an argument for what you're saying, that illegal immigrants in the labor force kind of increase corporate profits. Who's not for higher share prices and bigger dividends that go along with slave labor wages, right? It's immoral, but that's beside the point. People are motivated by profit. But I think that there's a lot less study that has been done about the recent surge of more than 10 million people. That's just in the last 36, 48 months. And so that grouping right there, I don't know that they are integrated into the labor force. What we do know is that surge of people in the last few years have been on the public welfare systems and have spent billions and billions of dollars. Some people say as much as like $1 trillion to support them, hundreds of billions of dollars to keep them in rent subsidized housing and hotels and food and clothing and pots and pans and transfer to everything to keep them afloat while they're here in all these different cities. I mean, FEMA alone spent $1.2 billion just last year in housing subsidies, and that's just one agency. So the point being is that I don't think that on the face of it, deporting the last 10 million people that came in, or a lot of them, is going to really affect anything except saving the American taxpayers a massive burden for years to come.
Well, and interesting you mentioned FEMA, which of course has been in the news recently because of the Californian fires. And FEMA, it seems, doesn't actually necessarily have the budget to deal with the many natural emergencies, natural disasters that America will face over the next few years, just as a natural part of the cycle of weather, climate, and so on. And yet they're spending such extraordinary sums housing illegal migrants.
Right. Well, I mean, it is true that these are separate cost centers. There's disaster relief is its own budget line item, but it certainly doesn't help anybody in the United States to have a couple of $1 billion going into supporting illegal immigrants. A couple of $1 billion could go a long way to helping hurricane victims in North Carolina or fire victims in California and whatever else, God forbid, happens between now and the time we can get more budget. But definitely FEMA is in the illegal immigration support business all of a sudden for the first time. FEMA isn't in the illegal immigrant support business. They just did that out of total desperation because the people that came in are not in the labor market. They're on public welfare. Not to mention, I didn't even mention, the healthcare systems and all the hospital systems that are having to pay 100% of all the costs of this, and they're all in the deep red. Different issue, different day, but FEMA should probably not be in the illegal immigration business at all.
Yes, it's quite surprising that it is. Finally, Todd, I wanted to ask you about Latin America and the Western Hemisphere more in a more geostrategic sense, because Donald Trump has talked about taking back control of the Panama Canal. It seems the administration are dead set on renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And I wonder whether this means that inevitably, because illegal migration is such a huge issue and a huge concern, as well as the flow of drugs and crime into America, inevitably America's reach, its exercise of power will expand more into Latin America than it has done under previous administrations.
Right. I think what Trump is doing, mentioning Greenland like he has, and Panama Canal is he's messaging not to the Panamanians or Denmark or anybody like that there, or the Canadians. He's actually messaging to the Chinese, who know full well that they have been very hegemonic in penetrating, into the American sphere of influence, the backyard down there in Latin America, through business, it's soft power. And the Chinese control the entrance. The Chinese companies, state-run companies, they're not military, control the Colón entrance from the Caribbean side to the Panamanian Canal, and also the exit into the Atlantic side. And that's an espionage problem. It's an intelligence problem. And they also, control certain parts along the Panama Canal. I mean, if worse comes to worse, push comes to shove, they could sink a ship in there, or they could block it in some way, on a dime. And Trump doesn't like that. So he's just messaging, hey, I'm on to you, what you're doing, and in Greenland and in Panama and lots of other places in our sphere of influence. And we're going to start pushing back. So beware, we're firing some rounds over your bow. That's what I think is happening. And I think it's misconstrued by a lot of people, because I'm not sure. I think he is purposeful in his vagueness about who he's targeting and why he's doing this. Although he has come out more recently and said it's about China.
Well, I was wondering, actually, I know I said finally last time, but this time finally, I was wondering about whether you, in your experience in the Darien Gap and on the border, have you seen much evidence of Chinese involvement? Because we do read reports of it, that, well, there are Chinese illegal migrants, that may be a separate issue, but that China may be at best letting things happen, at worst possibly adding to the illegal migration problem at the southern border.
Well, I have met a lot of Chinese immigrants coming through. They're mostly young men and women, very well put together, unlimited funds. These are not dishwashers coming through from China. That's for sure. These are people that are spending very large sums of money to get here. I don't know that I could say, like some people do, that the Chinese are doing it on purpose. I think there's actually evidence that the Chinese don't like this. They control exit visas. You have to get an exit visa to leave China. And so there's evidence that, and I testified in Congress last year about the Chinese immigrants coming through and what that means. And what I told the congressional committee that I testified before is that I do believe that the Chinese government, the Beijing spy masters, would be fools not to take advantage of this to get some of their best and brightest spies into the United States. I'm almost positive that happened. We might not know for a couple of years until we catch one or two, but we will eventually catch one or two, and it'll all be revealed. So I think that there is some danger in that, but I don't think we've had almost 80,000 Chinese cross the American border and enter the United States, and they're here, and they're educated. These are people that will probably gravitate toward universities and research institutes and all of the usual places where they steal our stuff, and exfiltrate technology and cutting edge research back home. So I don't know. I think it's mixed. I think that partly, they're probably sending some spies in here, but they also don't want their whole population to leave without their permission permanently into the United States. They may not mind the remittance money either coming into the economy.
If it was a functioning system, though, those sorts of migrants would be applying for H-1B visas and so on, wouldn't they?
Right. But, there are caps on that and limitations. So if the American government is just letting everybody through, and all Chinese, I'm not unaware of any Chinese that have ever been repelled or expelled under the Biden administration, they're 100% allowed in. That's over now. All Chinese that we catch are going to be pushed back into Mexico at the very least. And a lot of them that are in the interior are going to be rounded up and flown back to China. And they better take them too, because look what happened to Colombia.
As for the UK's own migration problem, why don't we know more about who is in the UK? Michael Simmons speaks to the writer Ed West.
This week, population projections from the ONS were released, showing that the United Kingdom is already larger than France. By 2032, the population will have grown by nearly 5 million to over 72 million people. But what's really interesting is, as this graph shows, births and deaths are going to cancel each other out, which means that the entirety of that population growth is coming from immigration. And the ONS say that in the decade between 2022 and 2032, that 10 million people will have arrived in the country. But migration may have actually already peaked. If you dig behind the ONS's projection figures, you actually see that their highest year for migration was in 2023. So the peak for migration may have already happened. Perhaps the real story, though, is can we even trust these figures? Do we know how many people are even in the country? If you take one example, whenever the ONS do their net migration estimates, they're often revised up by hundreds of thousands of people. And as this animation from the Spectator's data hub shows, the population forecasts change drastically every time they're redone. And joining me to discuss all this today is the journalist Ed West. Ed, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Do you know how many people live in Britain?
No. I mean, I could guess.
What would be your guess?
Well, the official number is, I think, 68, and it was 67 the last census. I would guess 70, so I'm a million. I'm like a moderate conspiracy theorist in this. Some people say it's much more than that, but I think it's probably 1 or 2 million over.
Million over.
Yeah.
And when you wrote about this sort of phenomenon on your Substack last year, you mentioned that one of the first sort of conspiracy theories that set this off was to do with how much we're spending in Tesco.
Yeah.
Can you take us through that?
Well, the Tesco truthers, this was an online thing, and it was, I think, around 2015. They were saying that you can tell how many people actually live in Britain because, like, Tesco knows, because they're the major supermarket. They have till receipts of basic necessities, and since these are things everyone gets, they can basically calculate how many people live in the country. And their argument was it wasn't I think the official figure was 65 or 63 million at the time. And some people said it was as high as sort of 80 or 90 or 100 million. And this was initially sort of debunked, and it was kind of comic talking points. I think BuzzFeed did a sort of debunking. And since then, there have been, especially since the pandemic, there have been a number of indicators that the actual population is much higher than we suspect.
And what are some of those? Because obviously the Tesco stuff, as you say, like some of it was debunked. We as a society ideally would not be relying on Tesco to work out what the population is. What are some of the official sources and what's wrong with them?
Well, the problem is the ONS don't know. And I think they would be openly saying they don't know entirely. And there were a couple of things during the pandemic. The number of people who were registered as taking a vaccine, I believe, was 4 million more than the actual population of England, which would sort of cause concern because people don't go and get the vaccine more than they have to.
Yeah.
There was also NHS England, the number of people registering for GP was about 6 million higher than there are officially in England. And obviously, there may be fraud in a lot of these cases.
Sure.
And in many cases, people might just be registered twice and the system hasn't picked up on it. But there are also a number of other issues. Most recently, the Telegraph estimated this month, I think, that the illegal immigration population of London is about 1 in 12. It might be, full facts say that might be wrong, it might be 1 in 13. And some people have disputed that, but I think the number is probably certainly high.
Yeah.
And certainly probably 1 in 20 would be the lowest estimate.
On this number that the Telegraph used from, I think it was from a report for Thames Water, where they came up with
so
this
yeah, water is another thing.
Yes, exactly. And they came up with 1 in 12. If it really was as high as that, wouldn't we sort of more like visibly see it? I mean, I would think that if 1 in 12 people in London really was here illegally, there'd be, for example, there'd be the sort of scenes of like homeless camps that you see in other sort of European cities like Paris, for example. But we don't have that to the same extent in London?
Well, I mean, if you go to the Strand, there are sort of lots of people queuing up, and it's quite dystopian. You could go to the area around Warren Street in Euston. There's a sort of homeless encampment. I mean, I think there is certainly a massive kind of. There are indicators that we are poorer than the official metrics would have, which would be an indication that there are actually more people living in. It's known lots of people are living in sheds, for example. If you've ever had anyone who's ever tried to buy a garage will know the council will always take an interest because lots of people who live in garages, for instance. There have been a number of cases where landlords have been convicted for massive overcrowding. People, like 40 people living in 3-bedroom houses. I think there are lots of parts of the country, especially parts of London, the poorer parts, which are obviously much more overcrowded than we imagine. And, it's kind of, some of it's quite Dickensian. So, the main thing that people think is a kind of indicator, as well as sort of shopping tills. There are even people, talk about the water. They talk about the quality of phone receptions being an indicator, that because there are far more phone accounts than there should be, and obviously lots of people can have more than one account, so it's hard to know. But most of these things come down to a basic inability of the state to account who is coming in and who's coming out. I mean, there's no question of that.
And do all these sort of examples and indicators that you point to, do they all sort of show it going in the same direction, i.e. we're off by undercounting? There's no...
Yeah, we're not under...
So it's clear that the population is larger than we think, it's just that we don't know how much larger.
Yeah, because there aren't huge numbers of people secretly escaping from, even from the Labour government.
Of course.
But there are lots of people coming. We know... well, partly it's because our way of counting people going in and out is very primitive, and a lot of it was to do with just sort of head counts at airports, where they would randomly sample a very small number and sort of guess a wider number from that. But when back in between 2015 and 2017, there were an estimated 500,000 people who had just gone missing. They'd gone in with no idea if they'd left. And they had no right to be here. Yeah. And there were another 200,000 people who had left, who the state didn't know had actually been here in the first place. So judging from that, it suggests that we really don't have much of an idea.
Could we do things, better to have an idea? So countries like Sweden have a sort of a national population register. Obviously, 20 years ago, the idea was mooted to have an ID card system.
Right.
Should we be doing something like that so that the state has a proper idea of, or a more accurate idea of, not just how many people are here, but who specifically is here?
So our system really relies on sort of trust and consent in the way that... So the ONS... do surveys, for example. In many countries, these are mandatory. But the British, it's always been a sort of voluntary thing because it was assumed that people would sort of, do the right thing. And I filled in one of these ONS surveys in the past where they call up random people. But also stuff like the census. The census is obviously not picking up a lot of stuff. The census relies on people being truthful about their status. And obviously there are huge incentives for people not to be, especially if they're living here without the proper... legal right to, then why would you fill it in? Oh yes, by the way, I've got 10 illegal immigrants living in my house. I mean, you wouldn't do that, would you?
And on that census point, obviously the last census was carried out in the spring of 2021.
Right.
It was during the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, and also it crucially I think happened before the sort of Boris wave of migration. Right. So some people have said that we actually need an emergency census maybe next year or in 2 years' time, rather than waiting that full 10-year period.
That has been raised as an issue. I mean, this is the point that Sam Bidwell made in his article, that really the extent of the migration under Boris Johnson was so much larger than anything else, even under Blair, that it's just not possible for the state to keep up with who's living here. I mean, I think emergency census kind of sounds... it sounds like a good idea. I don't know whether the government's going to be keen on it. Mm-hmm. The question of ID cards, I used to be... I suppose everyone gets less libertarian as they get older, don't they? But I was very much against it because I thought it was a kind of like continental
and you
thing,
could say we already live in one of the most surveilled states in Europe.
A friend of mine tried to get a cutlery set the other day, and he had to show a picture to Amazon of your face to make sure you're over 18. So it's kind of bizarre. We are incredibly regulated in some ways, but the states, Sam said, I think, was it the state what Big Brother's watching, but he's not counting.
Yeah.
I think these things are kind of very basic. I think the issue of partly the issue of illegal immigration is one that many people in government and in the system generally aren't particularly keen to tackle. They think it's a right-wing talking point. They think it would be bad for the economy to deal with it. It's a hassle. It's really difficult.
And is there something inherently kind of un-British about it? Because obviously, Brexit and various political movements since then have capitalised on people's justified fears about immigration and illegal immigration. But then at the same time, we saw that when different political leaders have taken a more hardline approach, so for instance, Theresa May had the go-home vans, there's that sort of outcry against it. What do you think the actual mood of the British people is on?
I think the go-home vans were very typical of the kind of completely wrong approach, which was to speak very harsh language, but actually not really do anything about it. I think you should be, nice and kind and welcoming, but you should actually enforce the law quite ruthlessly. I mean, if you go to Japan, they take. I know this is coming to Europe as well. Comes to parts of Europe, but things like the fingerprints, and you have a little. They make sure they count you in and out. They're all very welcoming, but they make it sure in the little video before and say if you commit any crimes or if you try to sell drugs, you're in big trouble. And that's a much better way. The van thing was a kind of gimmick, which I just don't think is very effective. If you want to be twee and British about it, and I'm not saying you're twee, but if you want to if you want to like British values, it does seem a bit coarse and like even dare I say vulgar. So you
wouldn't want Britain to sort of take inspiration from Donald Trump 2.0's approach, which is, to be very hard line about illegal immigration as soon as he came to office?
No. I think you should enforce the law. If people come here illegally, they should be removed. There are obviously exceptions. If someone has been, if someone's been living in the country and has never committed a crime and has been a good citizen, then they can apply for an exception. They could write to the king and asking to be allowed to stay. But as a general rule, yes, I think it's totally fair that people who don't do things the normal way. That is even in itself a kind of signal. If someone cheats the system in getting in, they're less likely to be a good citizen going forwards. So you've already set, it's like a bad precedent for their behaviour.
And if we were to have a crackdown, if the government wanted to take a more hardline approach to immigration in general, do we, given what we've been discussing today, do they actually have the tools to do that? Could they go and find the potentially 1 million, 2 million people in the country that we don't know are here and aren't meant to be here? If these surveys are not working, could the government even do it?
I don't see why not. It's very hard. For example, this is why the ID cards. It's very hard to get by in things like employment and housing if the ID card system is in place, because you can't really continue to function in society. Yep. The only area I would say there shouldn't be any ID checks is health, because I think if someone's having a heart attack, just like go and see a doctor, rather than worry the doctor might have you deported. But otherwise, I don't think these things are that difficult. We are surveyed in so many different ways. We are the surveillance capital of the world outside China. And although that is the bad thing, generally, in many ways, it does allow the state to kind of take action. I just think this is one of the problems when people say, "Oh, there's so many." It's like, okay, but the more we hang around, do nothing about it, those numbers go up. It just gets harder and harder. So you're pushing the problem down the road. And if these do things, for example, the problem with the measurement things, if you measure something better, you have a better idea of what kind of services can be provided. Because the population goes up, you need more hospitals, you need more schools potentially, blah, blah, and most of all, you need more housing. And if the population goes up and if housing numbers don't go up, then the cost of housing goes up. And, that is an existential crisis right now in Britain. And I think illegal immigration is obviously adding to it if it's created a situation where, sort of slum landlords are, using this as increase the market.
And lastly, so you seem to suggest that, that maybe an ID card system would be a potential solution to this problem. Better measuring would be a solution to this problem. These are the solutions, but Do you think the government is ever going to do anything about it, or is this just going to be pushed into long grass forevermore?
I think a lot will depend on actually Trump. I mean, this is something I wrote about this week, is that most of the countries in Europe are very frustrated by the inability to do certain things. In many cases, it's human rights laws that stop. Even Denmark, which has been very effective, in many ways, is frustrated by the same problems. So is Italy, so is Britain. So we're all sort of watching Trump to see if that happens. I mean, America has far more illegal immigrants. And again, the problem is that the more illegal immigrants you have, the higher numbers of hard cases there will be as well. And it makes it harder for the state to discriminate between people who should absolutely be removed and the kind of borderline cases where a bit of mercy is shown. I don't know how that's going to work out in the States, but I think everyone in Europe is going to watch it. I don't believe, if you go through history, far more primitive states than ours have been able to deal with this. I mean, if you look back, the mid-19th century, Karl Marx arrived in Britain on the boat from Belgium. Everyone on board that ship, they were all noted. Everything about them was noted. The state knew exactly who was on that boat, and they made a note of it. I don't think, if the mid-19th century British state can do that, I don't think it's really that hard for us to do today.
I spoke to former diplomat Charlie Parton about China's United Front strategy. What does it want from it, and how does it help the CCP's agenda? The United Front is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party, but more widely it's a strategy. So let's start with the principles of that strategy. What are we talking about when we're talking about a United Front?
I think that's very wise, because the United Front Work Department has become the whipping boy of the press, and actually we need to see what it's really about. So the United Front strategy says that you identify the main enemy. So back in the early days of the Communist Party's struggle to come to power, that was the KMT. Nowadays you might say that it's the United States in the global struggle. So you identify that main enemy, and you attempt to move the allies and those who are friendly to the main enemy to a neutral position, and those who are in a neutral position to a friendly position to China or to the Chinese Communist Party's aims. And often you start with the easier targets. You'll see that China's been putting a lot of effort into some of the smaller, less developed nations because they're more easily influenced and brought on side. But ultimately, when it comes, say, to the United Kingdom, the United Front strategy would be to move us from amity and alliance with Americans to start with into a neutral position.
But actually, out of its 12 bureaus, most of them are domestic facing. And of course, we in the West hear about it mostly in terms of the China-West struggle. But domestically, let's start with that first. What are its purposes and targets?
I think that's a very important point, because we always think of it as something that's out stalking abroad, whereas in fact, of course, it's a very important department. I would say one of the 6 main departments in the Chinese Communist Party. It is right up there as one of the 6. And delving slightly into its history, in the struggle against the KMT, Mao identified what he called 3 magic weapons, and that was the party itself, the People's Liberation Army, and the United Front. And there it was, doing the United Front strategy of peeling off those who supported the KMT and bringing them into support of the Chinese Communist Party, even though they weren't communists or party members. And so now within China, there are probably, the United Front is in charge of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Phew, I got that out without a stumble, but it's difficult. And that is, in a sense, as it says on the tin, a consultative body. And the Chinese Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist though it is, does consult its people. I mean, it may not then go in the direction that the people may or may not wish, but it certainly wants to consult them, because it needs to head off any unrest or likely causes of instability, because its main aim is to stay in power. Politicians like to stay in power, and they have the ability to do so. So the People's Consultative system throughout China, at 4 of the 5 levels of government, provincial, provinces, prefecture, city, county, town, and then right down to the sort of township and the rural levels, at 4 of those there are these consultative bodies. The biggest one, of course, and most famous being the national one, which meets in full plenum once a year at the 2 meetings. Now, that system employs somewhere in the region of 620,000 people.
Right.
That shows you how important it is.
And that's a state arm of the United Front, which is a party organ, technically. Is that right?
No, I mean, I suppose you could say yes, but I mean, these days the distinction
sure.
between what is party and what is state have been frankly eroded. So,
And within that United Front now, then, because the communists are in power, they don't have to fight the KMT anymore. Who are the people who are non-communist members, non-communist people who are within its kind of lines of sight in China?
So if you look at the 12 departments of the United Front Work Department, and here the likelihood of my remembering all 12 is probably non-existent, but it's sort of non-party intellectuals, non-party people, religious people, ethnic minorities, students who are abroad and have come back, Hong Kong and Macau people, Taiwan people, the private sector, very important indeed, business sector.
Yeah.
And then there's always, as in every Chinese sort of document and organisation, other people who need to be united to the cause, basically.
Yeah.
So a catch-all.
And also these nominal oppositional parties, which is something of
And of course the 8 democratic parties. How could I forget the 8 democratic parties?
Because supposedly China is the democracy, and there are these nominal parties that effectively don't have power.
No, they don't, and they follow the lead of the Chinese Communist Party, and they are slightly thematically. I mean, if you're a member of the medical profession, you'll join one of them, and there's a Taiwan one as well, and scientists and intellectuals will join another. So yes, they are again there to sing in chorus with the Chinese Communist Party.
And so is it fair to see the United Front as a bit of like a soft arm of state power, in the sense that it's not exercising hard power, it's not locking anyone up, it's not what the Ministry of Public Security does, but it does kind of influence thoughts, it kind of softens up any dissent, or as you say, neutralises them?
Well, it has two roles, I suppose, that the whole system. I mean, one is to pull in views and ideas and that idea of consultation, but also to promulgate the line and make sure that everybody knows the direction that the Communist Party insists that they go in. So is that soft power rather than hard power? Yes, I suppose it is. Yeah.
Well, I guess just in some of the reporting, it seems like some of the domestic projects, at least, can almost be counted as community outreach. Foreign Policy ran a really good article on this a couple of years ago about how the United Front was funding things like roads or amusement parks, mainly in minority ethnic regions, in order to say, look how good the Chinese Communist Party is. You know, that almost feels... If it's very different, I think, what the United Front brings to mind in the Western kind of consciousness when we talk about it. You know, it almost feels like so nebulous and almost bloated as a government department to say, oh, our work is just to make people like us. I just wonder about what the methods are and what the kind of key KPIs are. What are the metrics for success for them?
That's about what the KPIs are. I don't know, but
I guess they don't need to do that because they don't necessarily apply for budget in the same way.
But in a sense also, don't forget that all China's officials will have United Front objectives in their annual work plans. So, you know, in that sense, binding the non-party people to the party can encompass a whole range of activities depending on the energies, enthusiasms and creativity of cadres on the ground, who will get, you know, brownie points or end of year approbation for what they've done. So yes, it will be very well funded. It's a very important thing because it's a great arm in maintaining the stability of the regime and ensuring that the non-party members accept what the party wants, the direction that the party wants the country to go.
Yeah, and it has waned and waxed in popularity, or rather in importance, according to the state mechanism, over the time of its history, even though Mao called it one of his 3 magic weapons. But under Xi Jinping, has it revived in importance again? Because Wang Huning, who is the strategist behind 3 successive Chinese leaders, has been put in charge of it.
Correct, and don't forget Wang Huning is a member of the 7-man Politburo. So yes, its fortunes have come and go. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, of course, it was dissolved and was only reconstituted in 1979. But Xi Jinping has put a lot of emphasis on it. In 2015, there was a big conference where he made it very clear that its powers were going to be increased, and over the coming years it was. I think in 2018, for instance, it took over overall responsibility for the Ethnic Affairs Commission and the religious, the body in charge of religion, amongst others, and also the Overseas Chinese office as well. All then became part of the United Front system. I mean, they were performing United Front functions before, but they were now administratively directly under the United Front and controlled by the United Front.
So let's talk about that foreign arm then. You've mentioned the Overseas Chinese. What is the United Front strategy when it comes to overseas Chinese communities?
Well, it's to serve the overall... I mean, let's just step back one in the sense that as China has gone global in all aspects, not just trade and investment, but in many others, culturally and in terms of promoting its own soft power, so the systems that the party has found useful within China are extended outside China. And the United Front, of course, is one of the, I would actually say, 10, but we probably don't have time to go through all the 10 methods of the way that the party is advancing towards its second centennial goal, which is to basically dethrone America as the number one superpower and order the world so that it better reflects China's interests and values. So in that sense, the main aim, one might say, of the United Front abroad is to undermine America and put China up there as the number one. And that means detaching from, as we said at the start, detaching from support of the Americans, their current allies, or those that follow some of their policies.
And so what are some of the methods it uses in doing that?
Quite a lot, actually. And I think, first of all, one might say that it's important to say that, as ever, the survival and stability of the regime is number one. So even abroad, where there are many Chinese students, academics, businesses and others, probably the first role of the United Front abroad is to keep an eye on those and to make sure that they're not picking up values and habits that might later threaten the Chinese state when they go back, but also to encourage them to go back. I mean, these are people who've picked up useful skills and training and can serve China in its development. So that I think is one of the main roles abroad. What else? Well, one would say to ensure that the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party puts out about itself is much more accepted abroad. Of course, it uses external propaganda, but the whole point about the United Front is that it's using the people within the country to do its work for it, in a sense. The old Chinese phrase of borrowing a boat to put out to sea is applicable. But bringing alongside our politicians, our media, much more to support China, and certainly not to attack China. Sometimes to obscure what the Chinese Communist Party is doing abroad by putting a different spin on it. I would say that one of its main roles also is to, as almost a forward radar for things like, or for people who could be useful to the Chinese Communist Party's aims. Now, science and technology comes immediately to mind. It's a very, very important aim. And part of the role of the United Front will be to ensure that those in a position to work out where science and technology is in the UK are reporting back to it and then back to those in China to exploit those leads, maybe to invite one of our top scientists to China to give a lecture and talk about things that perhaps he or she would be better, might be a little bit sensitive. So I think that's a very important aim. And I think we could probably talk about, well, we can edit this, but in this aspect, the intelligence aspect of it comes to fore. Do you want me to broach that now?
Yeah.
Okay. And I do think it's right to regard the United Front work department as it's not an intelligence service by any means. It's not like the CIA or MI6 or whatever. But it does act as a forward radar.
What do you mean when you say it's not the same as CIA or MI6?
Well, it doesn't run agents, and it doesn't
Right.
collect classified information in the way that an intelligence service does. But on the other hand, if it's managing to make contacts with scientists and technologists who could be very useful to China, perhaps on extremely sensitive stuff, including military and etc. As you know, Cindy, as well as I, that the Chinese for information and intelligence, Qingbao is the same word. There's not much of a distinction between what we regard as intelligence, very classified information, but actually information that could do severe damage to us if it went to China, like some of the science and technology that we should be protecting. So the aim of the United Front Work Department would be to spot those sorts of opportunities and pass those back. And it might pass back opportunities to the Ministry of State Security or to the military intelligence or to scientific organizations with or without connections to the military or the repressive regime, or to other departments.
So let me ask a devil's advocate question then, Charlie. How does that differ from diplomacy? Because isn't a good diplomat, when they are sent out into their posting, also meant to be making contacts within the media, within the recipient government, understanding what is being said, what are the trends, and passing those back to your home government? If it's not intelligence gathering in a untoward way, how does that differ from diplomacy? Other than the fact that the Chinese have given it a name that sounds relatively ominous.
And other than the fact that they do it in a sort of quantity that is at times almost overwhelming. No, I think the main difference is this difference between, and I wrote a paper on this, the difference between influence and interference. Influence, for sure, we all do that. Public diplomacy, which is in essence what you've just described, that's fine. But interference, I think, was best defined by the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, by the 3 Cs, activities that are coercive, covert, and corrupting. And that, I think, is where the line has to be drawn. It's quite difficult to draw the line because it's a sort of spectrum from the sorts of acceptable activities which you've described, the public diplomacy ones, right through at the far end of the scale to espionage and hacking and all the other things that are very obviously not acceptable.
And I think drawing that line is really important. And that paper you refer to, I often refer back to it, and it has a really good graph in it where you do draw out where that spectrum lies. And just to take one example, for example, we've talked about it on this podcast before, me and you, the Confucius Institutes.
Yeah.
You actually think that there is an iteration of Confucius Institutes which are okay in terms of they fall on the influence side of things, but then there are certain activities that it would do which falls on the interference side of things. I feel like in a lot of the Western discussion about China, there isn't that level of granularity. And so could you just explain what makes some activities okay and not others? I appreciate you at the 3 Cs, but for example, in the specific context like the Confucius Institutes.
Yes, because the diagram you're referring to sort of did have, if I remember rightly, a dotted line between the acceptable and unacceptable. But certain activities or institutions cross that line, and some parts of their activities, as you rightly say, perfectly acceptable. And I think the Confucius Institutes is a very good example. I mean, they've calls to ban them, and I think that's incorrect. Not just because immediately the Chinese Communist Party would turn around and ban the British Council, but actually what the Confucius Institutes do has advantages. We need more China expertise. We need more Chinese language and familiarity with Chinese culture, etc. Where I think that their activities need to be more closely controlled is in their attachment to universities and the interference that they bring to universities, putting pressure on certain departments not to have certain activities or to have certain activities. I've also said in past occasions that they must be fully in line with British law, not Chinese law, and the finances must be fully transparent. So if a Confucius Institute plays roughly the role of the Goethe Institute or the British Council or the Spanish Cervantes Institute, fine. I don't think that we should object to that. And if they don't put on activities about Tibet or Taiwan or Tiananmen, the three Ts, well, we're a free country. We can read about those. That's really not a massive disadvantage. But if they start interfering in our university China disciplines, then that is beyond the pale, and that is where interference as opposed to influence comes through.
Yeah, and one of the examples you give for interference in that paper as well was what you called elite capture. Now, that's come up quite frequently in the news in the UK recently because of Prince Andrew and his Chinese business associate Yang Tengbo, with the label of elite capture being put onto what Yang was allegedly said to have done regarding Prince Andrew. I want to talk about that case because what do we mean when we say a member of the elite has been captured, as it were?
Well, elite, right. I mean, we're talking about our leaders in business, in politics. Yes, I mean, the royalty has pulling power, undoubtedly.
Although he picked the worst one he probably could have been.
Top academics. But even Prince Andrew, in the past, certainly has had considerable convening power. So and capture, I think, is a bit of a dramatic word. I mean, that tends to imply that some of these people are actively going out of their way to work for the Chinese Communist Party. But what the Chinese Communist Party does is to align their interests with those of the Chinese Communist Party, by which I mean, if your business is going to flourish by pursuing a more pro-China line, if your business is not going to get certain contracts if you speak out, or if you're not seen to be talking to your ex-political pals or your ex-civil service pals in a certain way, then that is a form of, we need to invent, Cindy, another word rather than
coercion?
Capture.
It's
not necessary. I mean, it can be as forceful as that. I mean, if you're running, the example comes to my mind of the United Front is very keen to ensure that the media puts out a pro-China line. Now, that's easier, for instance, in our Chinese language press here in the UK, because many of the owners of that press may have other business interests with China, and those can be promoted by the Communist Party or hindered. So, but the same might apply to any British media or organ if they've got other pressure points which the Chinese can put on them. So, I mean, you talk about the Yang Tengbo case, but also the other one is the Christine Lee and Barry Gardner case. I mean, it's £500,000 to a member of the Labour Party in opposition, the shadow business spokesman, if my memory serves, who would likely to have become the minister. And does Christine Lee, I think, is indeed a member working very hard for the United Front objectives. Barry Gardner, well, I've experienced occasions when, in summing up in certain fora, which was his paid role at the time, the summing up has been completely at odds with what the three speakers have said. It's been very pro-China, and when I talked about this to another person who'd been on the same forum and at another time, she said the same.
So sorry, these are panels that he was moderating, and then his sum up was not quite...
Not moderating, but at the end had a role of to sum up the entire discussion. And so that 5-minute discussion, summing up, bore no relation. Now, one is not going to say he did that specifically because the money was there. But I think one has to say that if he didn't evince that sort of attitude, maybe the United Front wouldn't be funneling money.
I find it's a question that we find tricky in democracy in general with other countries too, in terms of what is justifiable lobbying, you might say, and what is undue pressure. When we talk about things like Israel, countries such as Israel, countries such as maybe even kind of South Korea. I've heard that Singaporeans can be a bit pushy. Yes. Again, I go back to that question of, is it just because the Chinese have given it a scary name?
No, I don't think so.
And do we have an answer for it in democracy in general when it comes to foreign powers trying to do this stuff?
I think we have to mention the deadly word FIRS, Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, because and whether China should be put on the enhanced tier, and when it is, certain things follow. And the basis of that is which countries are a threat to us. Now, obviously, Russia, North Korea, Iran, straight on. But is the Chinese Communist Party a threat to us? That's a very basic question, and I think the answer has to be yes. And I've written papers on this, and we could spend hours discussing it, and maybe we did if we have. But if that is accepted, then I think it's very important that there's far greater transparency and accountability on when you are representing or helping that country. So in the area of business, let's say, where there's a lot of money to be made, you have to be very careful because, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party, because Xi Jinping tells us this, controls everything, and he controls all businesses. It really doesn't matter whether it's a state-owned company or a private one. If the Chinese Communist Party wishes or sees advantage in using it to advance its aims, companies like Huawei, Quectel and others immediately spring to mind, then I think it's really important that those British people who are helping those companies should be transparent and accountable for it, because that's a different matter than if they're helping an American company or a French or a Korean or a Japanese.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So American kinds of influence or slightly more pressure is not kind of in the same bucket as Chinese.
No.
Yeah. And just remind listeners again about FIRS and what it means to be on the two different tiers, because that is a really live discussion at the moment that the government hasn't decided on.
Well, I think the main thing is that if China is put on the enhanced tier, if you are representing the interests of China, you have to register that. You have to log it so that it's known.
But I think the precise wording is that if you are carrying out activities at the direction of an agent of the Chinese state, isn't that right? Or Chinese state-owned company?
It is, but if a private company can be directed by the Chinese state, and of course they are. I mean, again, Huawei, Hikvision, Quectel, Newtek, they have whatever their wishes. They have no choice, and they are part of the Chinese Communist Party's move to secure this number one position in the world, to the detriment of our interests and values. Then I think that there is no real distinction, and that it makes sense that you register these, and that people know where you're coming from. So if you're advising the government because you're an ex-official who knows a bit about China, or you're an ex-minister, and you're actually having influence on the government, and I can think of a few names, then at least the government should, and everyone should be very clear that you're not necessarily doing this without some interest because you're getting paid a lot of money, or you're earning a lot of money, not directly, but the company is helping your advisory company or whatever.
Yeah. I've had conversations with members of the business community here in the UK, and as you know, Charlie, a lot of them are quite against putting China onto the enhanced tier. Places like Standard Chartered and HSBC have publicly logged their opposition, saying that this would just create more paperwork for them because they fundamentally, some parts of their business do work with Chinese actors. But one business person actually said to me, this actually also means that, a taxi driver that drives a Chinese businessman from the airport to his hotel might have to register if the law is poorly worded. Is that something that, is actively considered at the moment?
I think we have to have common sense about that. I mean, I think that's just, what word shall I choose?
Facetious, perhaps.
An unrealistic.
Okay.
Unrealistic example. And that's just scaremongering, I think, on the part of that particular
it's just
person.
That because of the tier that China is on at the moment, it means that anyone who's carrying out political activities has to register. And what the enhanced tier, as I understand it, Charlie, means is that anyone who's carrying out any activities, even if it's not political, has to also declare. So that's, I think, where this person was coming from, in the sense of you could be carrying out a service for them that is totally irrelevant to their status as a...
But as I say, I think common sense has to be, we're not talking about taxi drivers here, we're talking about people who are lobbying on behalf of these companies. Yeah. Basically, that's what it's aimed at. So those companies know what it's aimed at. And I don't think it's that onerous, actually, to have to register that, any more than anyone who works for the Houses of Parliament has to register their interests.
Sure.
I was an advisor to the Foreign Affairs Committee on China. I had to register every single earning and gift or whatever that I got. It's not that onerous.
Yeah. And when it comes to, for example, the Prince Andrew and Yang Tenbo case, would having been on the enhanced tier have helped? Because if Yang Tenbo was really an agent of the United Front, surely he would have had to declare that political activity anyway. What we're saying is that he didn't actually come clean about his links to China.
Given his background, I hope that...
and he's a member of the CPP-CC, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's a party member.
First of all, one hopes that the whole business of China being on the enhanced tier would raise awareness and transparency and
Sure.
and put much more effort into it. Secondly, it does open people to sanctions. I mean, the whole business of his appeal, for instance, against being excluded, which must have been highly expensive to the British state as well as to him and others. I mean, just if you read the judgment and you think how many lawyers are involved here, etc., etc. Well, that surely can be avoided. Sorry, China's on the enhanced tier. This is what the law says.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow. How does being on the enhanced tier mean that he doesn't have a right to appeal?
Well, but because if he has not followed the law, then clearly he's in breach of it, and can be sanctioned. And if that means excluding him, then there's no right. There's no reason for him to appeal.
Right. Okay.
It's much less grey. It's black and white.
Furs aside, then, what else can the UK or other democracies be thinking about doing, and what has it done already?
Well, I think the previous government has made some good moves. I mean, it passed the National Security Investment Act. It passed a new National Security Act. I mean, for instance, it was not illegal to be an agent of the Ministry of State Security until that act was passed last year. Extraordinary though it sounds, I mean, illegal to pass over classified information under the Official Secrets Act, but it was not illegal to be an agent. And there are things like the Research Collaboration Advisory Team, which goes around universities, talking about possible threats and how you might deal with them. So I think that's good. I think we need to do much more to protect our science and technology with help both to startups, that's financial as well as advisory help, but also help to our universities. Building on the RCAT, the Research Collaboration Agreement team work, and on the Investment Act, Security Investment Act. But beyond that, I'm much taken by the Australian who set up a counter-interference coordination office to show just how seriously they took the problem with a budget to make sure that there was a coherent strategy for dealing with it.
Was that targeted at China?
Well, of course, the word China doesn't appear in that, but we know, we know that it is. I think that the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments needs to be strengthened so that people don't go straight from being a minister or high-level civil servant into a job where they basically espouse the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, because that could influence the last few years of their work when they're actually still in office, thinking, well, I better not be too harsh against this, because then I won't get that nice juicy job at the end. So I think that needs looking at. And I think we need to talk to I'm sure we do, talk more to our allies about their experience of the United Front. Taiwan in particular, because that's the front line of United Front work. But also Australia, Canada, America, for instance. And finally, my biggest of ever hobby horse is we need a China strategy. I mean, this is just part of it. And I do hope, with some trepidation, that the China audit, which is there to sketch out UK interests, but you can't just sketch them out. Once you've sketched them out, surely the question arises, what do you do about them?
Yeah. When we last spoke, Charlie, you said that we were expecting the China audit possibly in spring, but you also made the point that springs are elastic. Do you still think that we might expect it in spring?
I'm expecting it to come out by April, by Easter, say.
Okay.
In what form and in what depth, and how that, whether there'll be the next step, which is the strategy, that's still unclear.
Yeah, of course. And then one thing that I've been writing about quite a lot is just why are we taking these high-level engagement trips without having that China audit done yet? And we've just heard that Wang Yi is coming to the UK later this year as well. And again, that's another trip that's been decided without actually a decision on China audit or any information.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Cindy. And the question, similar question I've been asking is that if you're the Labour Party, I think you knew several years before the 5th of July that you were coming to power, and you also knew that China's rise didn't date from the 5th of July 2024, and therefore one might have hoped that your foreign policy experts in the Labour Party had actually sat down and worked out in advance at least the main outlines of how they would deal with China. But so far we've not heard any of that.
Freddie also spoke to the journalist Joe Weisenthal about DeepSeek, the Chinese AI that has shook the world. What is it and why has it made such a breakthrough?
Joe, let's start with sort of what's happened for people that haven't really been keeping up.
Sure.
Over the weekend, a bit of fear broke out about what DeepSeek, the power of DeepSeek as an AI tool, coming as it does from China. This caused great convulsions in the stock market on Monday. That appears to have calmed a little bit yesterday, and then today we don't know. Am I right there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's just a tremendous story for so many levels. I mean, look, starting about late 2022, so a little over 2 years ago, OpenAI released ChatGPT, which was sort of the first major light bulb moment for people like, wow, this is incredible technology. You ask a question into a box, it basically does whatever you want to varying degrees of quality. That opened up this incredible sort of multi-year rally in all kinds of companies that were in some way connected to artificial intelligence. Still very unclear how anyone is going to make money on this. Still clear where any of it is going. Nonetheless, it's just so exciting, so novel to people that all the big tech companies, who are building models, they've rallied. NVIDIA has become the biggest company in the world because they make the very best chips for training these models and so forth. And it's gotten so big that, there is a sense in which the entire U.S. stock market, to some extent, is like a bet on AI because these companies have just become so big. And we know that Chinese companies of various sorts are extremely competitive and eating America's lunch and eating the rest of the world's lunch and things like cars and solar panels and things like that. We've known that for a long time. But the truth of these matter is that cars and solar panels just aren't that real important to the U.S. stock market. These companies aren't that big. They're not that profitable and so forth. And then DeepSeek is released. Now, weirdly, and we can talk about this too, the actual performance of the paper and its cheapness and so forth were actually spelled out in December, but maybe because it was Christmas and maybe because there wasn't a public chatbot, it sort of didn't get much attention. Suddenly, people start paying attention to the chatbot. It's very cheap. For almost any purpose, it seems to be just as good as not the most advanced model from OpenAI, but one of the more advanced models. And suddenly it's like, wait a second, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on all this stuff. Can it be made much more cheaply? And so you get this big stock market sell-off on Monday, which strikes all kinds of nerves from just pure finance to economics to national security. It's a great story.
Well, it is a great story because it does show just how manic things are around AI and how much money is going into how so little understanding.
That's right.
Because as you say, DeepSeek does seem to have been around for a while, and then suddenly there's panic because it goes a bit public. And NVIDIA's role is, there's a lot of talk about that too, isn't it? Because some people are saying, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that the arrival of DeepSeek should be good news for NVIDIA.
That's right.
And yet it was seen as very bad news for NVIDIA. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So I think there's the NVIDIA question, as it were, is sort of multiple dimensions. So one is we don't really know for sure the hardware capacity that DeepSeek currently has access to. Now, something that's very interesting about DeepSeek is that it was born out of a quantitative hedge fund in China. And there is this very elegant story that people like to tell, and it may even be true, that, speculative finance in China isn't as encouraged as it is in the West, and maybe they felt some pressure to do something productive with all their brains and all the chips that they have access. It's a nice story. I kind of want to believe it. I kind of think it's one of these stories that's a little bit too nice to, it satisfies our bias about this sort of, the cost of financial capitalism and so forth. But it's a nice story, but it is true. There was this quantitative hedge fund, and they seem to, on the side, have developed a large language model. They probably had access to some volume of NVIDIA chips, in part because there weren't really any export restrictions on some of the older models up until recently. I guess there are two questions, and there are sort of two ways to think about it. If you think that AI is just, say, some business tool that will be used to, say, for example, reduce the need for humans to do tech support at large organizations, and that there are some tools that exist and AI can solve that, then you would say, well, that's bearish for NVIDIA, because it turns out that if we believe all these stories, you just don't need as much chips and computing capacity to do some of these as we thought. On the other hand, if you say, no, ultimately, this is going to head towards something towards AGI, which I don't really know what that means, but these supercomputers that's sort of like smarter, 10 times smarter than a human, and we're still on the race towards that, then the other story is that you can do a lot with NVIDIA chips, and we just are going to need even more of them because we're going to use the algorithmic techniques that DeepSeek discovered to get even more out of these chips. But in the end, we're just going to use up this compute. And so in the end, we'll just be using all the same NVIDIA chips. We'll just be getting even more out of them. I don't know which story is true. I don't know. I sort of think it's almost like there's two. I get the impression, in a sense, that there is this sort of like Silicon Valley mindset and the Wall Street mindset. And the Wall Street mindset is like, okay, what is the business case for this technology? Can this be used to save money on human labor and improve productivity and improve margins, right? And then the Silicon Valley story is, no, you don't understand. We're building the new God here, and we're not going to rest because we're going to like save some doctor's office some money because they didn't have to have like a person booking the appointments. Yeah, maybe we could do that, but our goal here is to build the new God, and none of this slows down anything. In fact, it just accelerates it. And I don't know how much investors really believe the Silicon Valley story, but, there are different stories you can tell about what we're actually doing here with all this technology. And important to mention here is that everybody is still, except NVIDIA and a few other like infrastructure companies, are basically still losing money on all of this tech. But so far, nobody has really seemed to care.
Yes, well, the building the new god is of course a fascinating part of it, and I wonder if the point where Wall Street and Silicon Valley cross over is in a kind of lust for doom, as it's known. A kind of something like this comes out, various people kick it around, not necessarily tech people. They try it and they say, "Whoa, this is incredibly impressive." I just had a conversation about the meaning of the universe with a machine. And that leads to this sort of manic buying and selling around these stocks.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
That's right. One of the things that I think is really interesting when you think about, okay, what does it mean for the business of American tech companies? And again, the business of American tech companies is a really big deal for America because tech companies are how we fund retirement and college and so forth. We really need those stocks to continue to go up over time, I feel like, to sort of fulfill the contract, the implied social contract to the middle class and so forth. Like if stocks don't go up generally over time, we have problems. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and this is something that people have this is not totally novel, which is that we are now like this cements this idea that there is an arms race going on that could be said to be akin to the building of the nuclear bomb. And this idea that we must get there before China, that this is an absolute national strategic imperative, that we can't let China build God before America builds God. And so one bull case is, wow, if this is a national project now, there could be a lot of money flowing to big tech companies in the race to build God before China builds God.
And Trump certainly seems to see things that way. I mean, he's said it's welcome because it's competition, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, prior, it was last week or whatever, prior to the DeepSeek sell-off, one of the first things he announced was this project that it's so far, they're only talking about private sector money commitments called Stargate, involving OpenAI, involving Oracle, and so forth. The CEO of Oracle, Larry Ellison, has been a big Trump supporter, does a lot of government business. That there's SoftBank, of course, is involved in it. And this idea to build this like $500 billion company to build out data centers and so forth. So from day one of this new administration, even before the market was freaked out about DeepSeek, the administration has made it clear that AI and accelerating it is a national project.
And to what extent should a cynic see parallels between the AI story at the moment and the crypto story of the last few years?
Look, AI really does stuff in a way. There are some. I don't know. I think it's actually a little bit unfortunate because there's a lot of people who are, in my opinion, rightly cynical about much of crypto. And it sort of jaded them on Silicon Valley tech bros, as writ large, and this is just another toy for them. I actually think that's a little bit unfortunate because I think this is very powerful technology. I have gotten use out of it myself in multiple realms for both personal reasons, professional reasons. I've never coded software a day in my life. I made 2025. I'm like, one of my New Year's resolutions is I want to build some software with the help of ChatGPT. It's going to tell me the code. And I'm actually kind of able to do it. A little side hobby of mine. There is real stuff here. Now, again, there is a difference between the real stuff that you could do with it today and the true, like, we're going to build something that is smarter than any human brain. I think there's a sort of reason. It's not crazy to be cynical about this. And you know what? I think you sort of have this situation in which you have these doomsayers, right? You have these people who talk a lot about AI safety is really important. And they're like, we do not want to have this machine and it gains sentience and it exerts control over us. There's the famous philosophical experiment they call it, like, the paperclip maximizer. You tell the AI we want to build as many paper clips as we can, and suddenly it takes over all the world's computer system, and then it turns everything, including human beings, into paper clips, and we're all dead. Now, the funny thing about that is, like, that story that they tell also serves the story of the AI optimists, because they converge on this thing that this technology is very powerful. So in a way, the AI safety people and the sort of AI optimist builders, they end up telling the same story, and it's very productive for all of them, and it's very seductive. And now I think that the DeepSeek China story, it only adds to all of this, where in the end it all redounds to the benefit of the American AI model makers, because it just further accelerates the story that, like, something is being built that could happen that is just so tremendously powerful that we just have to keep rushing to it. So somehow even the cynics or even the safety people end up playing into the hands of the AI builders.
That's a brilliant way of putting it, and I'm sure you're right. Is your impression that DeepSeek, while absolutely mind-numbingly brilliant when you first use it, is it already starting to melt a bit under pressure?
Well, it's funny, so there's two things that people need to understand that make DeepSeek unique. So one of them is that it's open source technology. So which means that anyone can download the DeepSeek software, and you can actually run it on a high-end MacBook, which is really important because, we had the attempt to ban TikTok. Somehow it still hasn't been banned yet, despite what the written law actually says. Okay, so the first like, oh, are we going to ban DeepSeek? No, it is literally impossible. It is a piece of software that anyone can download. So the playbook of like, we're going to ban this, it should not even be part of the conversation, even as a joke, because it just doesn't make sense. I have friends who already have it running on their computers. Then there is the fact that, we're getting our first glimpse of, I find it actually very fun, of how Chinese internet censorship works, because you could go around and play with it, and there are certain questions it doesn't even answer. And there's something that is particularly fun about this. So DeepSeek is called a so-called reasoning model. And OpenAI has reasoning models too. And the way it works is if you ask a question, you can actually see, you can't see this with OpenAI, but you can see with DeepSeek the full train of thought that led it to an answer. So if I say, I'm preparing for a podcast with Freddie Gray, what should I know? It'll actually spit out a bunch of text that'll say, well, who is Freddie Gray? Well, it's a podcast. So he's probably talking about the Freddie Gray that hosts the Americano podcast. And now the Americano podcast is part of a UK publication. And so therefore he probably wants to explain something about the US to a UK audience. And it'll spit out this full thing, and then it'll give you the answer. But it's very cool. You can see the train of thought that exists before it gets to the answer. But what's really funny is that you can see the train of thought on the censored questions, and then suddenly the screen goes blank. So I did a test of it yesterday, and I said, historians like to talk about a period in the late 1950s where a country made it a very aggressive push in 5 years to industrialize its economy with devastating effects on the rural area. So I didn't say the Great Leap Forward. I just sort of implied. And then it started to say, well, what was something that going on in the 1950s? Mao Zedong introduced something called and then it went blank. So you can actually start to probe a little bit about learn something about Chinese censorship. It's like you can spot the point in the train of thought where it actually says, oh, I better shut up and stop talking about this. It's actually very fun. So in the downloadable version that you can run on your computer, you can actually ask it about anything you want. It'll answer your questions about Tiananmen Square. It'll answer your questions about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. On the hosted version, whether it's the app or chat.deepseek.com, you can actually witness the point it gets to where it realizes it needs to shut up. It's very fun.
That is wonderful, and I encourage all Americano listeners and viewers to do it. Play around with it. Lastly, Joe, I want to ask you about energy and power, because this is this is something you heard a lot about with crypto.
Yes, absolutely.
And it certainly seems to be true that AI is going to need enormous amounts of power. And that President Trump, in his communications, probably with Elon Musk, is thinking about American power needs for the technological future. How big a part of that story is that?
I think this is a great question, and there are so many dimensions. A friend of mine joked that, there's a lot of left-wing people have been very dismissive of AI, and maybe they're all going to become AI believers now that China has made a version. But, the strongman version of that is if you can get AI with much less power needs, which this sort of implies by the cheapness, then maybe you'll suddenly get a bunch of people like, oh, well, I'm pro-Chinese AI because it doesn't contribute to global warming the way the AI they're doing in Silicon Valley does. Now, all that being said, this is huge. And, there's a tremendously computationally intensive stuff. And again, if you actually just want to think about, U.S. versus China competition on AI, part of the dimension may be, well, who can build electricity generation faster? We know that China continues to add a lot of coal to its mix and clearly does not have the same internal anxiety about adding coal generation as we have in the United States. They add a lot more nuclear, et cetera. So I do think this sort of creates an impetus to figure out some of the structural / regulatory roadblocks that would apply to both coal, nuclear, and renewable generation in the United States and get them online faster. But if you're just looking right now at like which country is capable of adding power to its mix faster, this is at current should be another source of anxiety if you think about this as a U.S. versus China race.
Joe Weisenthal, it is always wonderful to hear your insights.
Yeah.
I hope we can get you back on again soon
Anytime. I always say yes.
to discuss P-Doom, the next phase of P-Doom.
Let's do it.
Thanks, Joe.
Now, charities seem to be swapping altruism for activism, so says the writer Guy Dampier. He comes on Spectator TV and discusses with our Lucas Dakutas and the writer Poppy Coburn.
Guy, you write that we live in a charity industrial complex. What did you mean by that?
So the charity industrial complex is the idea that charities are no longer the sort of Victorian donkey sanctuaries and orphanages that we think of. Instead, it's a highly professional sector. So in the last year, I think the Charity Commission said that there was something like 96 billion pounds in income for charities in the UK. And although there's about 170,000 of them, actually the vast majority of that money goes to a really, really small group of charities. And those are what I would consider the charity industrial complex. They're very rich, they're very professional, there's career paths in that, there's recruitment agencies specifically for this stuff. And quite often what they're doing is they're pushing a very left-wing view of the world. They're using the sort of moral authority of charity that most of us would naturally see as a good thing. You know, British people are amongst the highest givers to charity in the world, but they're using that not to help people necessarily, but to push for political advocacy.
And you note in your piece just how many charities we have, over 170,000, but not all of them would probably continue existing if they were only to rely on donations from the public. So where do they get their cash from?
Absolutely. So this is a recurrent thing. I love to do this with The Guardian. So I love reading The Guardian. And whenever you see an article that says, such and such a charity says this appalling thing is happening, you go on the Charity Commission website, you go to the accounts page, and then you scroll down to the very, very back end, and there it will tell you how much income they get and how much of it comes in donations, which usually under £5,000, they don't say who it comes from. So that's what I would consider normal charitable giving. You know, people giving 100 quid, people giving 10 quid. And then it'll show you all the grants. And the grants, whether they're from the government or whether they're from big foundations, that's where the real money comes in. And a lot of those bodies are actually, they're grant-giving bodies that are set up by very wealthy people. So they've got a charitable aim, but actually it's just very rich people pumping money into things. And you can see with, for instance, when Jeff Bezos got divorced, his ex-wife Mackenzie pumped billions and billions of dollars into all kinds of charities, many of which were basically left-wing activist pressure groups. So that's where the money comes from. You know, if you look at them, you can have a lot of fun. I think the one I mentioned in the article, it's got something like £1.7 million in income, of which 100,000 is donations. So if they had to live on those donations, they could employ, 3 staffers, and maybe they could get like a little coffee machine or something, but that's it. So the rest of it is coming from those big foundations, the big grant givers, and it's coming quite often from the government. So that of the 1.7 million, I think about 200,000 came from the government. So that charity was getting 2 times as much from the government as it was from ordinary people.
And Poppy, to bring you into this discussion, you've written about this topic several times. Would you share the view that Guy has also of this charity industrial complex?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first kind of became aware, or at least I started to really notice it, a bit like Guy said. I was reading Guardian articles about some of the legal cases that have been raised against the government during the Rwanda plan. And I think probably the area of charitable work where there's the most of this kind of egregious meddling by these trusts is in the area of migration policy. So Guy mentions in his article asylum aid. There's also the Joint Council of Refugees. a lot of these groups have tens of millions of pounds of money coming in, some of that coming from the government directly for translation services or legal aid. They are then using some of this money and this expertise to actually raise legal challenges against the government. And I was very struck by, I thought, this is clearly a case of political lobbying. We have pretty strict laws in this country about political lobbying. We are not America. We don't have elections that spend billions of dollars on, getting lobbyists, super PACs, etc. But we do have this massive open door situation where if your lobbying is done under the onus of, say, promoting an equitable cause, let's say promoting racial equality, which a lot of these asylum groups would be named as, you can then actually quite heavily intervene in political work. So that's really what I saw the charity industrial complex as, a way of using money to sidestep regulations that the rest of us have to abide by to do political campaigning in all but name. And we don't really have many powerful legal tools to fight back against that. And that's partially because of the way charity law has been written. I would add, under a Conservative government, this is a 2011 Charities Act that bakes in that little, two-handed clause.
So just to get this writing clear, both of what you guys have described, activist charities have used taxpayer money to oppose policy that a government was democratically elected to introduce. So effectively, we've been allowing charities to oppose a democratic mandate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I'd say like the feeling that you have in politics where you keep pulling a lever and nothing's happening, or you keep pressing a button, like I want less migration, let's say, or I want less like eco-regulation that's like gumming up my business or just my life. If you keep getting the sensation that nothing's happening, you can usually look at the charity sector as to why.
Poppy, why did the Tories, for example, having been in power for 14 years and presumably annoyed by the pushback on the legislation they're trying to introduce, why did they not decide to do anything about this?
It's politics of good intentions. The reason why this happens under David Cameron. David Cameron is very, very keen to reduce government reliance on quangos. And so he thinks, how can I deal with these arm's length bodies? Let's rely on the charity sector. The charity sector can fill in the gaps that will be inevitably left by our programme of austerity. So they work very closely with the charity sector. They big up the charity sector enormously because I think they're still operating under that framework that Guy has so clearly put out in his article, that these are still nice Victorian philanthropy groups. It's the old lady outside the supermarket rattling a collection box saying donkey sanctuaries or save the children. But in reality, those are the sorts of charities that you probably will be giving money to, but they are not the charities that are really wielding this enormous political influence. And so, I think there is an excuse you can give for the first couple of years of the Conservative administration. There's not really any towards the end. They are well aware of this problem. But again, I think there's this kind of optics thing. They think it's icky. I think it's mean to be seen as going after the charity sector. And so they essentially just left it alone.
And Guy, why do you think it is, more often than not, that it is the radical left who occupy quite a significant chunk in this charity sector? I mean, have we seen similar influence or lobbying of sort from the right of the spectrum?
No, we haven't. I think a lot of that is about the kind of people that go into it. So charity, I think, does appeal to people who are generally going to be more on the left-wing side of the spectrum. And the people who are more right-wing, I suspect, are probably more small c conservative. They're nice people who go to the Women's Institute and they are absolute pillars of the community, but they're not activists. And that's just not true for the left. With the left, it's a small number of charities that are really causing the problem, and it's probably a relatively small number of activists within that, but those guys are attracted to this. And they also have a thing from the left, which is that it's a more secure job market. If you go into these things, they're generally a bit less stressful. You're probably not going to earn as much, but you can have, a bit more social status. So you're swapping that social status, swapping money for social status. And it's one of the sort of regular problems you have with human capital, which is if you're right wing, generally you want to go and make loads of money because that's the best use of your human capital. And then you can produce a nice life for yourself. But the danger with that is you're producing money, but you're not actually making changes in the world. And so you get outmaneuvered. And again, the caring nature of it will appeal more towards certain left-wing people, or at least the right-wing people that do it will not be the kind of people who are activists. And over time, that creates a culture within the entire industry. So if you were a right-wing person, you're going into one of these organizations, you would have to be extremely careful about what you said and did. I mean, the article starts by talking about Oxfam. So all of us know Oxfam. We all probably have an Oxfam somewhere on the high street. Many of us, I'm sure, have bought books from Oxfam or whatever else. And here, the person who's running it is the former head of the Runnymede Trust, which is quite a left-wing race charity. And they're producing a report that's blaming Britain for stealing all the money from India, supposedly. Although obviously the actual historical work is extremely weak and doesn't really show that if you look into it properly. But that's the kind of world. If you're a right-wing person and you go into that world and you're sitting by, as the Americans say, the water cooler, and you're having a conversation, you're potentially in a lot of danger if you're going to say, "Oh, did you read that in the Telegraph yesterday?" That's not a world you're going to get on in unless you hide all of your beliefs. And if you're hiding all your beliefs, then your potential for right-wing activism is quite limited.
And Guy, you suggest in your piece a legal distinction should be made for those doing charitable work and those seeking to influence politics. And whilst I personally agree, I would ask that, would you not agree that a lot of charity actually arguably is political to some extent, or at least would hope that politics can make a change so that the charity no longer needs to exist for the sort of social issue it's trying to tackle? I mean, would you agree with that?
I would. I think if you take, let's say, a homeless charity, obviously there's a charitable element of helping homeless people on the street. We'd all understand that. And you would imagine that people that do that will have a great degree of experience, and they would want to say, how do we actually end people being on the street? How do we get ahead of it? How do we prevent it? And I think that's totally reasonable. But the problem is that when those two things are combined, what you get is the situation we have with the charity industrial complex, where people are using the moral authority of helping homeless people to push for policies that actually turn out, to be quite ideological in many cases. And that's a recurring issue. I mean, you see it especially, let's say, the immigration charities. There are a lot of things you could do to make the lives of asylum seekers less dangerous. But one of the key ones would be to actually have functioning borders so that people are not risking their lives in very dangerous situations to get to a country on the basis that they know that once they're there, they can sort of, manipulate the legal system to likely stay. But no charity will ever, on immigration, will make that argument. They will always say you need to have a safe route, or you need to just have functionally open borders. So that produces a dangerous, closed way of thinking. So my thought is that you should basically split the two up, and you should say that advocacy organizations have a greater degree of regulation, which prevents them being able to lobby and use that moral authority. But there'll always be a certain degree of crossover, in the same way that anyone that works in any research-based organization will have to talk to people on the front line of whatever the subject is that they're doing. But you don't necessarily want the two combined together.
And Poppy, would you agree with Guy? I mean, what would your suggestions be for reform?
I would. I mean, I think, as much as I think the charity industrial sector is completely out of control. I mean, one example I could give of one of those groups, which you would expect has a functional role to play. This is bail for immigration detainees. Is highly ideological. I've looked in some of the people that work there. I mean, they're self-described communists. They have a very politicized way of abolishing borders. They do receive money from the SBA Farm Bean Trust, from Joseph Rowntree Foundation. They have a lot of money coming in. I doubt anybody who's ever given them money on the street before, because, again, what they are advocating for is very politically extreme. But the problem really comes down to one of state capacity, I think. The issue of these charities meddling in politics wouldn't be such a big problem if politicians themselves weren't so reliant on the charities. So I think if we weren't constantly relying on politicized charities to do work, like to do translation work or to fill the gaps for legal aid, then the government wouldn't then be so vulnerable to these same people turning around and actively working against the stated goals of what the British people want. So, with so many other things that we on the right try to do, it does actually have to come down also to will on the part of politicians to actually to fix these problems and actually enact what they were supposed to do. I would also say, coming back on that political point, that's true, and I don't like heavy-handed meddling in sectors. It's not in my nature. It's not what I agree with politically. But I think it's worth raising consciousness about what has happened even in the last 5 years. So after the death of George Floyd and these big racial reckoning movements that have happened across the West, there was a mini sort of earthquake that occurred during the charity sector. So a lot of these older, middle-aged, well-meaning liberals, they might have been Lib Dems, you'd see them get involved in the local community. They were left-leaning, sure, but they were liberal. They were working within a liberal framework. They were essentially booted out of their jobs. And a new generation of young activists who were much more inflexible in what they believe they're doing, much more contemptuous of the line between political activism and charity work. Actually, Halima Begum, who Guy mentions in his article, is a good example of one of those people. She's just a straight up political activist. She wants to become a Labour MP. She's totally contemptuous towards Tory politicians. She said very unpleasant things about Suella Braverman. These are the sorts of people that are taking over the reins of these old-fashioned, generally pretty moderate charities. So while on the outside you might look at them and think nothing's changed, actually internally the body is completely different. And I think that the difficulty then as a policymaker is how the government perceives these charities versus how the public perceive them is slightly out of whack. So there is also something to be said of just, pulling back the curtain a little bit and going, hey, do you know this person is actually working at Oxfam, Oxfam, the nice local charity? Do you know this person's actually working at Shelter and they're in charge of, a £200 million a year endowment? I think, first of all, just naming these people and having an understanding of who they are and what they say in their own words, quite publicly, what they want to do is really important, because then we can start treating them as they would actually like to be treated, which is as activists.
And Poppy, I remember you got a bit of flack when you had written about this as well. Do you think British people just shy away or feel slightly uncomfortable about the topic of charity, almost in a similar way to the NHS? There's some sensitivities when discussing it. And I mean, for me, charitable work, I think there's an attachment we have to the idea that any charitable work is good work.
People basically hate politicians. Like, people don't like politics. They don't like politicians. If you ask people who are the least trusted people in society, they're going to say politicians. If you then have to turn around and listen to politicians saying, hey, this guy working at a charity, he's the bad one. Like, he's the person who's actually being subversive and, counteracting the things you want done in society. Obviously, your first reaction to that is going to be like, well, no, I'm not going to side with you. I'm going to side with the guy working at Oxfam. So there's a problem there, I think, when it becomes a political issue and it seems like it's a one-sided attack. And that's, again, why it's so important to expose these people for being activists. Activists, I don't think, are quite as popular as a nice person working at a charity who is helping to deal with homelessness or, child poverty. Again, you don't have to do much deep digging in these people. Just repeat the words back that they're saying. Actually having maybe a parliamentary inquiry where these people are just, this is actually what happened in the US. The US is much more aware of the danger of their big charitable foundations. They're much more skeptical about the work they do. They're often being hauled in front of congressional committees and asked about, hey, you said this in an article in the Washington Post. Do you think that's appropriate for someone of your station? Even stuff like just raising awareness would be so important, because that then would allow for politicians to actually start changing the law without an immediate public relations backlash. I don't think it can just be done by kind of tinkering behind the scenes and hoping they won't realise. These people are very politically aware and they have vast resources. It has to be done in quite a clever way.
Is Angela Merkel responsible for the rise of the AfD in Germany? Lisa Hazeltine joins Konstantin Egner to discuss what's happening in the country.
Angela Merkel threw this absolute bomb into the middle of the debate around immigration in Germany, and in particular chose to really strongly criticise her successor as leader of the CDU party, Friedrich Merz. I was wondering, could you take us through what that row is all about, why she felt the need to intervene now so close to the election?
So what essentially has happened is that there's no functioning majority government right now because the government fell apart. That's why there are federal elections coming up in February. And that's why it's much more doable to actually bring forward motions, even from the opposition, which the CDU are right now opposition party, and they brought forward 2 motions. We might not get into all the details, but one got the majority of the votes and essentially prohibits individuals from entering Germany if they don't possess any legitimate documents, e.g. passports, ID cards, whatever. That might also include, of course, legitimate asylum seekers who might have fleeing from autocratic countries and might not have passports anymore because they were taken away, or whatever happened there. So it's a broad stroke, and maybe it goes too far, it crosses a line. The thing was, the CDU and the CSU, which is the Bavarian chapter of the CDU, basically, more or less, they brought forward that motion, just, I think, initiating debate, maybe having some legislative success before the election. Problem was that it became quite clear that actually the AfD, Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, would support that motion. And their votes would essentially get them over the line, provide the majority. So that's why there was a lot of debate, heated debate about it. Friedrich Merz, the one who was leading the charge, couldn't really backtrack at some point. He just was stuck in a corner, and they just brought forward that motion in the Bundestag, the federal parliament. And yeah, it got at least one of the motions, received the majority of votes, but thanks to the Alternative for Germany votes. And that's why especially Angela Merkel, as of course previously the leading figure, not only of the Christian Democratic Party, but also of the entire country, was taking a stance against her successor, Friedrich Merz. Now, 2 things to consider there. First thing is that Merkel was never really fond of Merz. At certain points in time, she prepared others to succeed her, which then didn't really get through because of various things, scandals and whatsoever. Was a bit of a struggle to actually find someone who could succeed here as not only the Christian Democratic leader, but potentially as the next chancellor, which didn't happen then because Olaf Scholz became the next chancellor, the Social Democratic leader. But also, secondly, Angela Merkel, I mean, she's not like an outright proponent of like open borders or whatever, but she of course has a much more liberal stance when it comes to immigration compared to what now has been decided in the parliament.
There has actually been a lot of finger pointing around where the responsibility for the root of Germany's immigration crisis lies. So, as you pointed out, there have been some people who hold Angela Merkel responsible, Friedrich Merz among them. Do you think he has a point, or do you think, as Merkel was criticising Merz for it, he is actually the one who has sort of lost his way, sort of is devaluing the party that he leads by, in her eyes, I suppose, pandering to the far-right narrative around immigration?
I mean, both things can be true in a sense. First of all, Germany are in a bit of a predicament because they have been the most attractive destination for people coming from the Middle East, for instance, or from Western Africa, just because of the economic strength, because of the social system and a social welfare system and whatsoever. So, I mean, it's easier for other countries to maybe shut down borders or just be much more restrictive when it comes to immigration than to a country which where loads of people apply or come there and try to get in. So of course it's a bit of a different story. I think other countries have a much easier time to just deal with that. So that's the first thing, especially like historically speaking. And it's not like Germany has just been most favorable destination for asylum seekers, but also economic immigrants since Merkel was in power. No. That goes back decades and decades. So that's the first thing. And I mean, there have been taken measures when it comes to closing down borders, or at least border controls, which are usually only temporary within the European Union, but you can apply border controls, and they have been applied. I mean, there are much more restrictive border controls now at all the German borders, especially towards the southeast. So it's not like there hasn't been done anything, but I think it's not even like that the motion that was brought forward on Wednesday and got the majority. If there would have been a different kind of voting pattern there within the federal parliament, I mean, we would have a different discussion. But the fact that actually the Alternative for Germany, for the first time ever, basically provided their votes to get something done, which can have magnificent effects on Germany as a country, is a first. And there was always a talk about the so-called firewall, Brandmauer, which basically said that, all right, there can't be any collaboration between the center-left, center-right parties and all the parties, basically, and the Alternative for Germany on the federal level in the Bundestag. And now that has happened. So it will strengthen the AfD on the upcoming elections. And also it might actually weaken the CDU, because, I mean, it's a conservative party, yes. But, and maybe some of the members are also somewhat right-leaning, but there is still kind of a red line between CDU, CSU, and Alternative for Germany. There are lots of members of the CDU who don't really not only appreciate but accept the Alternative for Germany as a democratic party.
And so, talking about this Brandmauer, this firewall, do you think then that it was the case that Friedrich Merz sort of set himself a trap by coming to rely on the votes of the AfD to get his motions on immigration through on Wednesday? Or do you think it was a case that this was a political gamble that, as you were saying, looks like it might backfire on him?
I think he walked basically into a trap, or whatever you want to call it. It's not really a trap, but I think he set himself up for walking into a trap there, because even he tried to backtrack, rhetorically at least, saying that he doesn't really appreciate support coming from the Alternative for Germany. So he tried to maneuver himself his way out of the whole situation, but it doesn't really work at this point. So that's also, I think, the issue if you don't really have a working coalition at this point. I mean, Olaf Scholz and the government are still in place, but only until the date of the election and a little bit after that. And you don't really have a working coalition which would discuss such things beforehand, and then they would get a majority in the parliament, but just as a matter of process, but not really as a clear-cut, like, open voting. I mean, as it is done in many different countries, right? You do these things beforehand, you get to a consensus within the coalition parties, and then something is decided, but it's more of a formal act at this point. So right now, it's more of an open door to just bring forward anything, and maybe you get the majority, which can be appreciated to some extent, I think, yes. But on the other hand, it's not really workable, especially on a federal level, with a country of over 80 million people, to just fire out some ideas and then hope you get a majority of votes in the parliament. Not really. I mean, it doesn't work really that way, to be honest. It's not really how real politics works. But on the other hand, I mean, it might also backfire for the CDU in terms of just the election results on February 23rd, because they already have lost a little bit ground in recent polls. And also after that vote on Wednesday, they again lost 1%. They are now below 30%. So doesn't really help them, because there are still a lot of people who might think that conservative politics is needed right now in Germany, but still don't accept the Alternative for Germany as really a viable partner or whatever. And also, I mean, just yesterday, members of the parliament actually in the Bundestag discussed a potential, at least a process of then, how would you call it, of prohibiting the AfD, for instance. That's something that has been discussed, or at least starting the process, and then potentially prohibiting the AfD, eliminating them from the election process. And there are actually legal experts who say that actually there is ground to do that, because a party that is as aggressively fighting against the constitution can be prohibited and can be eliminated from the democratic process. There are also others who say that's not really doable, but at least, I mean, it's not like a clear-cut issue. It might actually be doable. So, but now with the AfD supporting a real political matter, brought forward by a Democratic Party, a center-right party. Now, of course, they also establish themselves as being part of a democratic process.
Yeah, it certainly is a conundrum. I was wondering if we could also talk about Olaf Scholz and his SPD party and how the fallout from this row and debate over immigration is impacting his party. Do you think that this could also help his chances in the polls? I mean, his criticism, as you've touched on, was that this proposal by Merz might not be constitutional sort of under German and EU law, but equally sort of the status quo as he's been campaigning on, particularly on the topic of immigration and how Germany deals with illegal migration and asylum seekers in particular, that clearly hasn't been working for him. So do you think that he will benefit from this row, or will he fall by the wayside?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I think he might benefit to an extent at least, because if you look at just how the voter landscape in Germany has changed over the past 3 decades, maybe. I mean, there was a time when if you voted Social Democratic, if you voted for the SPD, you were more of a left-leaning person. If you voted for the Christian Democrats, you were more of a right-leaning, conservatively leaning person. Now it's much more, it's a center-left and a center-right party, but there is kind of an open border, so to speak, between the two parties. So there are voters who are maybe one day vote for the SPD and the other day they vote for the CDU, and maybe even on the state level and local level they vote differently than they vote on the federal level, depending a little bit on what the particular parties propose for each election. So he might, Olaf Scholz might actually gain a couple of votes just from people who are now, let's say, disgusted by Friedrich Merz and the CDU, to use some strong words, and then decide, no, I mean, we weren't happy with Olaf Scholz and his kind of leadership style, and there was a crisis of leadership at some point, but still he's the lesser of two evils. So we rather vote for him than for Friedrich Merz. I mean, Friedrich Merz might be an appealing conservative leader to an extent. He, of course, comes from a liberal economic background, but he's not everybody's cup of coffee, to be honest, even when it comes to his personality and the kind of way he does things, and being maybe a little bit too pushy and a little bit too aggressive at times. So, I mean, there might be people who are much more content with Olaf Scholz, who is someone who's sometimes too laid back, but he's also someone who might actually gain votes because of that. So it's very difficult. I mean, there were times in Germany where before elections you could clearly tell who was leading the race and who was losing the race. Right now, it's much, much more open. And there's still the AfD, who in recent polls have had over 20% of the votes. I mean, that's just something you have to keep in mind. So they are also a clear-cut option to a lot of people, even though they won't lead the next government.
And this row around immigration, this debate around it, the rising popularity of the AfD in this election campaign has coincided with events that have been happening in Austria, where Herbert Kickl, the leader of the far-right Freedom Party for Austria, the FPÖ, looks like he is coming very close to potentially becoming Austria's next chancellor, and seems like this has really spooked a lot of democratic politicians in Germany in particular, particularly given how popular the AfD is becoming, as you say, sort of over 20% in the polls. But nevertheless, if German politicians are looking to ban the AfD potentially from being able to run or exist as a party, surely that would be a huge mistake, regardless of what you think of the AfD from a sort of a democratic political process perspective. Surely that would also backfire on them. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about that.
I mean, that's really also a question for legal experts and political scientists, because, I mean, there have been right-wing parties in numerous European countries being successful at the recent elections. If you look at the Netherlands, France, I mean, they might not always have won the elections, but they gained a considerable number of votes. And looking at the FPÖ, historically, I mean, even 20 years ago or so, there were FPÖ members who were Landshauptmann, which is basically the regional governor. So they were elected to be regional governors. So they're much, much more established. And that's really something, it's really hard to tell if you can completely compare the AfD to FPÖ or to Marie Le Pen's party or whatever. It's really not that easy. You can't just say that every right-wing party in Europe is kind of the same. No. There are vast differences. And when it comes to the AfD, to be from my personal experience, it's not like that every member of the AfD or every voter is like a right-wing, I don't know, an anti-democratic thinking person. No. It's not even like that. If there are grounds for eliminating the AfD, then it's based on there are some members who are not right-wing, but they are clearly walking into like Nazi anti-democratic territory. It's all about like a portion of members who are not really within the democratic realm operating. So, I mean, the AfD, if they would, I don't know, cancel out these people and just cancel their memberships, for instance, we couldn't even talk about anything like prohibiting the AfD and eliminating them from the election process. So it's much more about them and a number of members who are not really thinking democratically and who are not really accepting the current constitutional reality. So that's why, I mean, it's really hard to compare. You see that in other countries where right-wing parties are much more bourgeois and much more in the middle of the field. And even FPÖ, from all I have witnessed in Austria, is that, yeah, there might be a few who are a little bit out there, but most of the members are right-wing, and they might have ideas people don't really accept, more from the left side of things, but not really quite the same.
And looking forward to after February the 23rd, after the date of the federal election, it will fall to whoever wins the largest portion of seats in the Bundestag, most likely the CDU still at this point, to try and form a coalition. Now, of course, off the back of everything that we've discussed, it's hardly happy families in the German Bundestag. They've all spent the past couple of weeks ripping each other apart and will probably continue to do so up until Germany goes to the polls. So I was wondering, what do you think will happen in terms of Friedrich Merz's chances of successfully forming a coalition with some of the other democratic parties, and who you think at this stage they might be?
It really depends on a few results of the smaller parties. So right now, FDP, the Liberal Party, in recent polls, they are below the 5% threshold. They are at 4% and something. Same goes for the Linke, the left party. They are below 5%. If they get in, the entire complexity of the Bundestag changes because all of a sudden they have a number of seats there. If they don't get in, it's completely different in terms of like how many seats each party then has, even though maybe the CDU one way or another comes in at 31% or so. That makes things a little bit more difficult. If the FDP actually manages to get over the 5% threshold, which is, I mean, it's a pick 'em right now. You don't really know. Then, of course, they are also a viable coalition partner for the CDU. And even though FDP, they haven't really been strong in recent years, also didn't really do a good job in the government, which just folded in end of last year. Still, they would be a party that could collide with the CDU quite effortlessly. So it really depends on that. If the FDP doesn't get into the parliament, don't get any seats, and they are out of the parliament, which has happened before actually, then it might be a completely different story, and you might see CDU trying to form a government with the Green Party or with the Social Democrats. And as you said, it wouldn't be a happy family. It would be like a usual family party where sometimes people don't really like each other, but still find a way to eat some cake together, but not really on happy terms.
That's all for this week. Don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell, and give us any feedback in the comments. See you next week.